Now, as we honor Black history, I want to tell you a little bit about some incredible Nashville Black history, because what happened in Nashville in 1960 was so significant. Not only did it change our city, but it was so significant to the entire civil rights movement in general of the 1960s. Now, Nashville at that time in the 1950s and 60s was utterly and completely racially segregated. Nashville then looked more like a South African city would in the height of apartheid. But the social change that happened here, not only did it change our city forever, it ultimately influenced social change that was happening everywhere in America, and it happened here. And this came by way of the famous Nashville lunch counter sit-ins, which lasted from February to May of 1960. And these lunch counter sit-ins were part of a protest to end the racial discrimination that was happening at lunch counters in downtown Nashville, where African Americans would not be served at all. And this was organized by the student movement over at Fisk University, and then the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, which was filled with lots of Black clergy from around town. But what made it so significant was its discipline and training in nonviolence, responding with nonviolence. And so Nashville kind of mastered that and set the precedent for that, which just affected the entire civil rights movement. On February 1st, 1960, 4 Black college students sat down at a lunch counter reserved for whites, and they refused to leave. It was a direct challenge to Southern law and to Southern tradition.
Well, it's just not the things we're used to down here. I mean, they come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us, because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
As the sit-ins spread across the country, Fisk University students, John Lewis, Angela Butler, and Diane Nash, led other students to Nashville's first sit-in.
The students were dressed like they were on the way to church. We went into the local stores. These stores were known all across the South, and for the most part, all across the country. We took our seats in a very orderly, peaceful fashion. We stayed there at the lunch counter studying and preparing our homework because we were denied service. The manager ordered that the lunch counters be closed, that the restaurants be closed. We just sit there, and we continue to sit all day long.
The sit-ins continued without incident for almost 2 weeks. Then on February 27th, a warning came. Gangs of racist thugs were gathering downtown. The students sat in as planned, but the Nashville police did nothing to protect them. The students remained true to their strategy of nonviolence. When the police vans arrived, more than 80 demonstrators were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct.
The day that the police first arrested us, they announced to us, "Okay, all you niggers, get up from the lunch counter and, or we're going to arrest you." And their attitude was like, "Well, we warned you." So they repeated it a couple of times and nobody moved. And of course we were prepared for this. So they said, "Well, we warned you, you won't move, okay, everybody's under arrest." And then they turned and they looked around at the lunch counter again, and the second wave of students had all taken seats. And they were confounded. They kind of looked at each other like, "Now what do we do, you know?" And they said, "Well, okay, we'll arrest those two." And they did it. And then the third wave. And no matter what they did and how many they arrested, there was still a lunch counter full of students there.
Peace, quiet, and good order will be maintained in our city to the best of our ability. Riots, melees, and disturbances of the peace are against the interest of all our people, and therefore cannot be permitted.
The local Nashville black community began to unite behind the students. Black business owners supplied food to those in jail. Homeowners put up property for bail money. The court found the students guilty of disorderly conduct. Young John Lewis refused to pay the $50 fine. Instead, he chose 33 days in the city workhouse. Most of the other students joined him in jail. To fight the jailing of their children, parents turned to the power of their own pocketbooks. In 1960, buying power in Nashville was estimated at $50 million a year. That's almost $500 million today, with $10 million being spent in the downtown stores alone. That's close to $100 million today. Within a month, the boycott from black customers was almost completely effective. On April 19th, dynamite thrown from a passing car at 5:30 in the morning destroyed the home of Z. Alexander Luby, one of Nashville's Black City Council members, and the defense attorney for the arrested students. The blast was so powerful it shattered 147 windows in the Meharry Medical College across the street. Miraculously, no one was killed.
It was such an outrageous act that it could be very useful to a nonviolent movement then to move, okay? It was a uniting of the city, but the outcome would be decided by how we in fact channel that energy, right? And we then had the first major march of the movement. People began to gather. And we began to march, and students came out from the lunchrooms, and they came out from being on the campus grounds, and they joined, and they came out of buildings and dormitories. We filled Jefferson Avenue. It's a long, long way down Jefferson. After a while, there was a certain bit of singing, and as we came closer to town, it was merely the silence of the feet.
So the day after the bombing, Martin Luther King personally comes here to Nashville, and he speaks at Fisk University. And during that speech, he praises the Nashville students and specifically their approach to the sit-in movement, their commitment to nonviolence. And he says, this is the best organized and most disciplined in all of the South. King even went on to say that I didn't come here to bring you inspiration, but to gain inspiration from this great movement that's taking place in Nashville. Face to face on the steps of Nashville City Hall, Reverend C.T. Vivian condemned Nashville's mayor for his failure to speak out in the past. Diane Nash pushed Mayor Ben West to take a personal stand.
We needed him to say integrate the counters, or to tell Nashville to do what Nashville knows it should have done a long time ago, like about 95 years ago after the Civil War. So I asked the mayor, first of all, Mayor West, do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
And I tried as best I could to answer it, frankly and honestly, that I could not agree that it was morally right for someone to sell them merchandise and refuse them service. And I had to answer it just exactly that way. Of course, I received considerable criticism for it, but had I to answer it again, I would answer it in the same way again, because it was a moral question and was one that a man has to answer and not a politician.
So after weeks of negotiations between the business owners and the protest leaders, so much pressure finally causes them to reach an agreement. And so here's how it worked at first. For 2 weeks, certain lunch counters would host African Americans on certain days, and then those business owners would tell their employees, prepare their employees, you absolutely serve African Americans without trouble. You absolutely serve them without trouble. And then after 2 weeks, these limitations were all lifted, all the controls were taken off, and African Americans were able to eat and sit in various stores wherever they wanted. So then finally on May 10th, 6 downtown stores opened up their lunch counters to black customers for the first time ever. And the customers arrived in groups of 2s and 3s, and they ate lunch during the afternoon. There was never one incident. There was never any violence, no commotion ever again. And African Americans chose to end their 6-week-old boycott of the downtown stores. In the plan, this commitment to nonviolence, it successfully integrated the lunch counters of Nashville. And Nashville then became the first major southern city in the United States to begin desegregating its public facilities. Now, although the end of the sit-in campaign gave some brief rest to the civil rights activists here in Nashville, we know that there was still institutionalized racism, systemic racism. That still remained a problem throughout our city. So then over the next few years through the 1960s, there still had to be more sit-ins, protests, actions in places of restaurants and movie theaters and public swimming pools and other segregated facilities across Nashville. They had to do that, and that stayed that way until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which then made it illegal, unlawful to segregate in any public place in the entire United States. So what can be said about Nashville's role in black history was its absolute commitment to nonviolence. It became the precedent for the entire civil rights movement, and it was integral to the movement's success. And what's also amazing is a number of the organizers of the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins went on to be some of the great and most influential civil rights leaders in all of America.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before